jQuery is how we write one form of JavaScript and have it execute perfectly on all browsers. This is helpful because browsers don't implement JavaScript the same way. Some have different rules. Some don't trust certain features that you make, and they make you write different code for different browsers. jQuery bridges that gap, meaning you can write JavaScript for all browsers, and it will always just work. You don't have to deal with different browser support whatsoever. jQuery is also considered a library. It's not a framework, meaning you're allowed to mix your normal JavaScript with it and nothing bad could happen. And there aren't strict ways to write your JavaScript with jQuery, whereas with a framework such as Vue.js or React.js, there are certain rules you want to follow, and there's a lot of magic behind the scenes that you don't see, which makes learning other frameworks like React a little bit harder. Starting in about 2019, React.js and Vue.js became very popular, and people now say things like, oh, don't bother learning jQuery, but it's literally used on millions and millions and millions of websites. So why wouldn't you learn a skill that's so clearly in demand? And the nice thing is you can learn jQuery in a single day. Learning React.js or Vue.js is going to take a long time because they're such big frameworks. They're powerful too, but if you just need a little assistance with your JavaScript or you simply want to write less code, then jQuery is 100% for you. And truthfully, from a senior developer's perspective, you don't need to learn jQuery or React or Vue. You can do it all with vanilla or plain JavaScript, but these tools help us do more with less code. Furthermore, and again, this is a truth bomb, using React.js or Vue.js on about 95% of all websites is complete overkill. You'll end up spending too much time writing React for a small feature that can be written with jQuery in a matter of minutes, sometimes a matter of seconds. That's why I choose to write vanilla JavaScript or jQuery on most of my websites, unless there's a real need for something big and complex. Then I tend to choose React or Vue. So the reason that you should be learning jQuery is because simply market demand. Hundreds of millions of websites are using it. You might as well learn what is in demand. Hello and welcome to our first lesson on jQuery. In this lesson, we're going to be installing jQuery on our website. So first things first, we need to open up a browser and go over to jQuery.com. Now there's two ways we can install jQuery. We can download this and use it locally on our computer, so we can use an actual file on our computer, or we can use this thing called a content delivery network. So I click the download button there and we can download it. There's another way. We can use Yarn, NPM, Bower, all these other things, or we can take the better way, and where it says other CDNs, we can use Google CDN, Microsoft CDN.js, or Deliver, or JS Deliver. And I'm just going to use JS Deliver just for no particular reason. And in this course, we're going to be using jQuery 3.5.1. And so what I want to do here is get the minified version, because we don't need all the extra source code. We don't need all the extra spacing or code comments. We just need the actual JavaScript. And we don't really care what it looks like because we're using jQuery as a library. So let's copy the HTML. And let's open up Visual Studio Code or any text editor that you want to use. Let's create a new file here. Let's do HTML5. That's not going to work. We're going to have to save this first. So I'm going to save this as index.html, and then I can do HTML:5, hit tab, and it autofills a bunch of cool stuff for us. And we can do jQuery 101 as the title. Now, when we're using JavaScript, we typically want to put JavaScript at the bottom of our body. Not outside of the body, but just at the bottom, just before the closing body tag. And that code that I copied there, I'm just going to paste that in here. And we're going to see that this is coming from cdn.js, deliver.net/npm, yada, yada, yada. And so what a content delivery network is basically a series of servers across the world. And when you try to download this particular file, it's going to go to the closest server to you. So it's going to be fast to download. The nice thing about this is they can also provide a layer of caching. And when there's caching, that means if someone has already downloaded this from a particular website somewhere else on the internet, and you're now accessing the same file, it's already been downloaded to your computer. And so you don't have to download it again, which is really, really nice. And that's actually the reason we're using a content delivery network, a CDN, is because we want that extra layer of caching just to make our website super fast. It also means we don't have to maintain an extra file. Now, when we're writing this, we need to have a script tag and a closing script tag. And inside of here, we are going to be waiting for jQuery to properly load. So even though this file could technically be downloaded on your computer, your browser might not have fully recognized that the whole file is there and evaluated or executed the code yet. So it might not fully know. And so we do this thing where we wait for it to load. And we do that with this weird little syntax here. We'll talk about syntax in its own lesson, but for now we just need to get this up and running. So we can do document ready function console.log jQuery is loaded. And so what we're doing here is and again, we'll talk about syntax in a little bit, but we're using this as a selector. We're selecting the entire document, the entire page, and when it's ready, when the document object model is loaded, when our JavaScript is done loading, execute this function. And that's called a callback function. We'll talk about those as well. And then once that's all done, just console log jQuery is loaded. And so if we go to our browser, open up a new tab, and at the top I'm just going to File. That's just outside of my recording area, but I just went to File, and then we can go to Open File. Select our index.html file, and we're going to see absolutely nothing happens. But if we right-click and go to Inspect, and go to Console, and let's not preserve the log there. It's just a setting from a project I was working on. Let's make this larger. It says jQuery is loaded. So every time I refresh, it says jQuery is loaded. And it should be almost instant. So you wouldn't actually notice that it is or isn't evaluating your JavaScript or your jQuery library. It's supposed to be super fast, but this is a good little method just to make sure that we can continue to use jQuery in our code. So before anything, what I would like you to do is make sure you go and get jQuery from a content delivery network, create a brand new index file like this, and then just write this weird little script here. And again, we will dissect this over and over again, so you'll be super familiar with what this actually is, but you just need to write this out to begin with, and then we will move on to the next lesson. So once you've done that and you're ready, let's head on over to the next lesson where we talk properly about jQuery syntax. All right, when we're talking about jQuery syntax, it's a lot like JavaScript syntax. It is actually, it's just all written in JavaScript. It's just a certain way to write our JavaScript. And so in our last lesson, we wrote this weird document.ready function thing. So let's break this down a little bit. So that's where we're going to be putting all of our code in every lesson moving forward when we're talking about jQuery. But the syntax here, the style in which it's written, looks a lot like this. So we've got a $sign with parentheses, and this is our selector. And so if you come from JavaScript, this is a lot like the document.querySelector method. The only difference is we don't have to write this anymore. We can simply write a .div in here, and that's going to select it for us. So that's a nice little shortcut. So in here we have a selector. Then we have some sort of function or event or method or something happens with this selector. And so we see up here, we see ready. So we've selected document, and we're going to say when it's ready. Or when we have a button, we can say on click, or we can do something. So there's some sort of event that happens here. And this by itself is just a method or a function. And then it takes this thing called a callback function. And most things in jQuery take a callback function. So it's going to do a thing. So it's going to select something in your page. It's going to then execute or register some sort of event. And then when that event is happening, what do we do? And this is where we wrap it in a function. So this is just an anonymous function. And this just makes sure that everything stays scoped in here. So it's a nice way to make sure that your variables don't leak out of this particular area. Now in our body up here, let's say we have h1 dot custom class name with an ID of custom ID. And so you can actually see how I wrote that. If I just undo that, you can see I wrote h1 dot custom class name ID custom ID. And this is exactly like writing CSS. So if you know CSS already, this is going to be incredibly easy for you. This is regular CSS. And it just happens to be that VS Code has this thing called an emit abbreviation. So you can write your CSS and just simply hit tab and it will create your element for you. So we can say in here, hello world. And now with our selector, and let's go ahead and create a new example here. In the last lesson, we did the document.ready function, yada yada. We can use semicolons. We don't have to use semicolons. It's regular JavaScript, so regular JavaScript rules still apply. And we can use a selector in here. So we can select this H1 like this, and we can do a thing here. And that's going to select this H1. We can also say dot custom class name, and that's going to select this H1 along with any other element that has this class name. Or if we wanted to get something completely unique, we could do ID custom ID. And again, this is just regular CSS. And so when we're writing CSS, this is exactly how we write it anyways. This is how we create a custom declaration using a CSS selector. And so in jQuery, we do the exact same thing, and in modern JavaScript, we do the exact same thing. So we have several different ways. We could even get really specific and say, grab all H1s with a custom class name. And let's say text is going to be change me. And we're jumping the gun here a little bit. And we're going to learn about text down the road, but I want to show you that this is an example. So what this is going to do is select this element up here, and then it's going to take that text and change it from hello world, which we know it's going to render hello world in big letters, and it's going to say change me. Or let's change it to this was changed via jQuery. Let's save that, refresh our page. And it says this was changed via jQuery. But if I refresh fast enough, you can see that it flickers. And so if I right click and view my source, let's make that just a wee bit bigger, we can see that it actually says hello world. So when the page renders, it's saying hello world in here. But once jQuery is loaded, it changes it to this was changed via jQuery. Now that is pretty much all the syntax we need to know right now. There's a little bit more when it comes to event listeners, but we'll tackle that when we get to event listeners so that I don't overwhelm you with a lot of information at this moment. But the thing you need to know right now is this and that. Now what I would like you to do is this exact example. Go ahead, create an H1, select that H1 somehow using either a class ID or an element selector, and then change the text with .text and put some sort of new text in there. View it on your page. If it changes properly, voila, you have now written some jQuery. It is as easy as that. When you're done, let's head on over to the next lesson. We'll talk a little bit more about selectors specifically. Okay, welcome back. Let's talk about selectors. So a selector is largely what jQuery is built around. And the reason for that is because when you're working with JavaScript, you're usually working with your document object model, which is all of your HTML in here and the way that it's structured. That's your document object model in a nutshell. And so we can have an H1 in here, and this could be our custom title. And let's just set up an example here. We could have a button in here, and this says this is a custom button. Let's go ahead and select paragraph, and let's go ahead and put some lorem in there. Now let's change that from a Django template to a standard HTML template. So if I type lorem, hit tab, I get lorem ipsum. P, hit tab, I get a paragraph. Lorem, hit tab, I get another lorem ipsum paragraph. And let's just add some unique things in here. So we've got a paragraph, and let's go ahead and make sure the paragraph and the button, and all I did there was I selected one area, and then on a Mac, I hit Command click. On Windows, it's likely to be Alt or Control click, so I can type in two places at once. Class, custom, class. And so let's go ahead and work with some of these selectors now. And I'll just make that a touch smaller here so we can see it all on one screen. So let's go ahead and select our H1 and change this. And actually, in fact, before we do that, this is what our page looks like. We've got 2 paragraphs, and I'll make this a little smaller there. We've got a title, we've got a button that does absolutely nothing, and we've got 2 paragraphs. This paragraph and this button share a class name, and the h1 and the paragraph are by themselves. In fact, let's do one extra one. I'm just going to throw this in here. This wasn't planned, but let's throw it in here anyways. Let's add an ID to this paragraph. Let's call it custom ID. And let's select each of these. Let's select our h1, so we could say selector, and maybe I will make that bigger. Selector h1 dot text changed via jQuery. Now that's only going to select this one h1, but if there's multiple h1s, it's going to change them both. So let's do this. Our custom title 1, our custom title 2. Let's go ahead and refresh our page. And it says, you can actually see that it flickers there when I refresh over and over and over again. And when I view the source code here, we see our custom title 1, our custom title 2. And we change them both to change via jQuery with a single line of code. How nice is that? So we selected all the h1s on the page and we changed it to change via jQuery. Now in regular JavaScript, in vanilla JavaScript, we have to loop through all of those and change them one by one. jQuery does that automatically for us. Now let's go ahead and select all of our paragraphs. We can do $, parentheses, paragraph, dot HTML instead of text. And let's do a bold tag in here. This is bolded and replaced. And so we know what this is going to do. We just saw this example with an h1. It's going to select this paragraph and this paragraph. It doesn't care about the class name or the ID at the moment. We're not selecting those. We're just going to select both paragraphs. And let's go ahead. And when we refresh our page, you can see that it flickers again quickly if I refresh fast enough and over and over and over again. And it says this is bolded and replaced. It selected both of them. Now what's nice is you can select multiple things. So let's say we didn't want to do that. We wanted to select all the h1s and all the paragraphs, but we did not want to select our button. And we wanted to change the inner text to changed via jQuery. Let's go ahead and execute this. So it's going to select this one, this one, this one, and this one, and it's going to change that text to change via jQuery. Let's just make sure that it's working. Let's say number 2. And it selected all of them. And all we did there was another regular CSS selector. We said h1, comma, p. So select the h1, also select all paragraphs. Now, because this is still JavaScript under the hood, we can select a paragraph. Let's select a paragraph by its custom ID, and not ID, it's class. Let's do dot custom class, and where I'm getting that from is right here, dot custom class and dot custom class. But this time I'm selecting just a paragraph with dot custom class on it. I'm not selecting the button yet. If I wanted to select both of them, I would get rid of the p, but I want just p with a custom class, and then I can say dot text changed again. And let's add a number 3 here. And when I go back to my browser here and refresh, what this is actually doing, believe it or not, is it's selecting this, 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 and this, and changing it to changed via jQuery number 2, which we see here. And then because, again, it's JavaScript under the hood, it's going to execute one line at a time. So it executes that line, then it's going to execute this line. And so it selects our paragraph and changes it to changed via jQuery number 2, but then it also selects p.custom class, that's this one. Let's take a look at how we can dynamically add HTML to a page. And so for this, we need an example. Let's give our page a div with a custom ID of custom ID. And there's not going to be anything in here, so it's going to be completely empty. And we know that if we go back to our browser and we refresh our page, there's going to be nothing in there. And if we look at our source code, it just says custom ID. There's nothing in there. Let's go ahead and add some custom HTML in there. So in the last couple of lessons, you saw that we would select this ID with custom ID, and I'm using the ID selector here, dot text in here. And so we were using text, and that's all well and good, but that's not actually going to add any HTML. So if we wanted to add an h1 in here, we could say h1 hello world. And unfortunately, this is not going to do what we expect it to do. And so let's go back to our code here. it's actually going to print out h1 hello world slash h1. That's maybe not what we want. Maybe we want to actually add some proper HTML in here. So if we inspect this, we go into our elements and I scroll that up, make that a touch smaller. We can actually see that there is no h1 element. It's just plain text. And so that's not always what we want. Instead, what we want is to use HTML. And so how this works is you have a selector, you do .html, opening parentheses, and then you put your HTML in there, whatever that HTML is. It can be a string like this, or it could be a variable. And then you just close it with your closing parentheses. And the semicolon is optional. So I'll sometimes use it, I'll sometimes not use it. Let's go ahead and refresh our page. And now we see we actually have a proper hello world h1. And in our document object model, in our source code here, what our browser sees it as, we have a proper h1. So what's cool about this is we can now go in here and let's write a span with a class of custom class span text slash span. So this is getting a little bit hard to read just because it's getting to be wrapped on multiple lines here and because I'm pretty zoomed in with my editor. But if we refresh, we're going to see there's a span. Now we can go ahead and select that span once it's created. We can go ahead and select that span, text, changed. And we're going to see that it goes from span text to changed, just like that. Now, spacing's a little bit off, and this is kind of an ugly example, but it is a very functional example. And jQuery isn't about making pages look beautiful. That's what CSS is for. jQuery is meant to be a shorter way of writing JavaScript. So there's a difference between HTML and text. We learned about HTML. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and learn about .text. What I would like you to do for this particular lesson is go ahead and select an ID, or an element rather. It doesn't have to be by ID, it could be by class name, could be just select all the divs on the page, do .html, and then write some actual HTML in there and take note. You can always right click, inspect, go to Elements tab, and you can see that there are actual HTML elements in here. Once you've done that, let's head on over to the next lesson. Let's take a formal look at change text. And we've actually worked with this a lot so far, a lot, in pretty much every lesson so far, maybe even every lesson so far. But let's take a formal look at it. And so in the last lesson, we looked at .html. In this one, we're going to be looking at .text. And so what we can do here is, let's not do a div or an h1. Let's do a section element. And let's say, put some HTML code in here. And so we can select this selection or section element with $, parentheses, section, dot, and then we can either change the HTML or the text. Now, if we wanted to actually put HTML code in here, we can't use HTML. So if I put a bold versus bold tag, so this is old way of doing bold, this is the new way of doing bold. If I just save this and refresh my page, it tries to render itself. So if I go into the section here, it fixed up my B and strong elements. And that's because we're actually injecting HTML onto the page. We don't need to do that though. If we actually wanted to see this code, we could just do .text. And that's the difference between .text and .html, is when I refresh the page, it actually shows up. So I can write HTML in here now, which is really great for coding websites, coding blogs, things like that, whenever you need to actually display some sort of code. Now your task for this particular lesson is to select an element. It doesn't have to be a section, it could be any element. And then inside of that element, with jQuery, I want you to use .text and .html and write some HTML inside of it and see what the difference actually is. Now you've seen what the difference is on my screen, but it's not quite the same as actually getting some hands-on experience. So go ahead and get some hands-on experience. And when you're done that, in the next lesson, let's go ahead and talk about getting form values, because form values aren't quite the same. Let's talk about how we can get form values now. So in the last couple of lessons, we did this cool thing where we did .html. We also did .text. Now, That's cool, and that works with elements like a section that has content inside of it. Content inside of it. And that's fine. But what if we're working with an element that doesn't have content inside of it? What if we're working with an input element? Now, an input element doesn't have a closing tag. There's no text inside of it. How do we deal with this? So first of all, let's save this. And this is what our page looks like. It's just an input element. It's a very boring input element. But what we can do here is we can now go ahead and get the text in there. So let's give this a default value. Hello world, just the de facto sort of text that every programmer tends to use. It says hello world. What if we wanted to be able to pull this value out? Well, let's start by first selecting it. We're going to select it by an input. It's the only thing on our page, so we can just select it by its only input value. And then we can do .val. Now there's two things we can do here, and I'm actually going to talk about .text and .html as well in just a moment. But we can do this. Const value is equal to console.log said value. And all we're doing here is, again, we're selecting that input, dot, and then we use .val, not .value, .val. And we aren't putting anything inside the parentheses here. It's just empty. And so when I refresh the page and go over to my console, it says hello world. And that's pulling that value out of here. So we can change that value to hello world 123, and when I refresh the page, it says hello 123, or hello world 123 inside of the console. Now, what if we wanted to change this? Well, that's really easy too. We could change this. We could say, this is changed. And all we simply do is add a value. Now, we don't want to necessarily work with this anymore. Let's get rid of that. So we're going to select that input, say that value, this one up here, needs to be this is changed. So let's go ahead and check this out, and it says this is changed. But in our source code, it says hello world 123 still. It just happens to be that JavaScript and jQuery together are overwriting that value. And so you can actually see when I refresh fast enough, it flickers a little bit. Now that cool little trick with .val when it's empty, we can do the same thing with .html and .text. So let's go ahead and give that a quick little example as well. Section, let's just throw some lorem in here, some lorem ipsum. I type LOREM, hit tab on VS Code, and it automatically fills it with lorem ipsum for me. So I don't have to think about some sort of dummy text, because sometimes it's hard to come up with examples like that. So what we can do here is now we can select this section, and we can grab that text, and we can put that in a variable as well. So const text is equal to console.log text. And when I refresh this page, we have all this text in here, and we also have all this text in here. Now notice that it actually also has the white space, and that white space, if I refresh the source code, comes from right here all the way up to that new line in there. And there's also extra white space at the end to the end of the section. We can do the same thing with .html, and let's make this bolded. So we're just going to bold the word REM. We can see that it's bolded in here, and it's bolded in here. Now, here's the difference. When we do .text, notice that this one is bolded up here, but REM over here in our console, it has the HTML stripped out of it. So just be careful there. So that's a fun little 3-in-1 lesson. What I want you to do, though, is just ignore this for now. Just tuck that in your back pocket. And I want you to create an input element and use .val to set the value of the input element. When you're done that, let's go ahead and talk about how we can dynamically add HTML to a certain part of a page, like inside of an element to the front or the back of it. Okay, let's talk about appending and prepending HTML. And so what we're going to do is we're going to select an element, and then we're going to add some more element or some more text at the back of it and the front of it, inside of that particular element. So what we've seen before is we could have like an H1 with some text in here, and we've been able to select that H1 and then use .html to put more HTML in there. But let's say we wanted to add a span at the end, or we wanted to add a span at the beginning. Well, we would have to pull all of this out, store it in a variable, overwrite that variable with HTML inside of it. There's actually a better way to do this. So first things first, let's go ahead and do document.ready function. And that just allows us to put our jQuery code in here safely. Let's go ahead and select that H1. Okay, H1 is selected. Now I can use append, A-P-P-E-N-D, or prepend. Append goes to the back, prepend goes to the front. So let's do append, and let's add some HTML in here. Let's add strong. This is bold. And that's, again, that's going to select this H1, and it's just going to append some stuff in here. So let's go ahead and save our page and refresh, and you can actually see that when we inspect here, H1, at the end of it, we have HTML. We have strong, this is bold. And in fact, that was a bad example because it's hard to see. Let's do underline. There we go. This is bold and this is underline. Let's make sure that's consistent. Consistent copywriting there. So this says some text in here. This is underlined. We could also select that same H1 and we could do prepend, and let's do italics. This is italics. And what this is going to do is put some code at the very beginning. Code in here. And that's exactly what it does. It says this is italics. In our H1, we've got I, some text, U. But in our source code, we don't have any of that. And so now we are dynamically marking up our page just using JavaScript and jQuery. Now, a fun little thing here is if we wanted to, we could chain these together. So let's go ahead and put this on a new line because JavaScript doesn't care about new lines. And let's go ahead and get rid of this one. And so we're going to select this H1, then we're going to append, then we're going to prepend. And what this looks like, essentially, is just this. We're chaining it together. But we can put these on new lines, so it just looks a little nicer. And this will apply both of them together. So let's write in here and in here, number 2, so that we know this is actually working, that this isn't just executing the same code from the last example. So let's refresh our source code, and we see that nothing has changed in here. Our jQuery has changed, but the actual DOM hasn't changed, the document object model. Let's go ahead and refresh the document object model. We're going to see this is italics number 2, and this is underline number 2. And that worked. And all we did was, instead of selecting both of them, we just selected one, we used one selector, and we reused it. So we appended and we prepended. Now what's cool about chaining here is we could also do .text. This is changed text. Then append, then prepend. And so some text in here is going to say, this is changed text, and it changed all of it for me. So this H1 no longer has any of the contents that were original to my page. jQuery has now overwritten all of it, and it has prepended and appended some HTML as well. What I would like you to do, as a little fun task, is go ahead and give this a shot. You don't have to worry about the text part, but go ahead and append some HTML, prepend some HTML to any selector of your choice, and then when you're done that, chain them together like what I've done. When you're done that, we're going to look at selecting an element and then adding some HTML outside of it, but before and after. So some here and some here. Because right now, prepend and append only work on the inside. We want to now work on the outside. In our last lesson, we appended and prepended some HTML to our page. In this lesson, let's go ahead and add some HTML before and after an element. So let's give this a div with an ID of target. And there's not going to be anything in here. No, I lied. Let's put something in here. Add HTML before and after this. And so let's go ahead and because everything in jQuery is basically selector based, let's select that target. We can even do div ID target. Then we can do dot before, and that's just literally dot before. And let's put an h3 in here. Hello world, this is a title. And let's do it again. Let's select the div, select it by its ID, and then let's do after. And let's do a paragraph in here. This is a paragraph. And so what our page is now going to do is it's going to select this element. And before this element, just before it, right in here, if I could spell any words correctly, right in here is going to say, hello world, this is a title, and afterwards it's going to say, with some sort of paragraph in here, this is a paragraph, and this one is actually going to be an h3. So it's going to look something like this. Now let's go ahead and get rid of that so we don't have that in here, and delete, 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 save. Let's view our source code first, make sure that it's not actually adding anything in there. And let's go ahead, refresh this. Hello world, this is a title. Add HTML before and after this. This is a paragraph. And if you don't have your console open or your dev tools, you could right click, you could go to inspect, open up the elements tab, and you can see there's now an h3. There's the same div that we originally targeted, and there's a paragraph after it. Now, just like in the last lesson, we can, if we wanted to, chain these together. And so we only need to select this once, and then we could say before and after do these things. Let's go ahead and save this. Actually, let's go ahead and make sure that caching isn't happening. We'll just put a number 2 in there so we know that this is working the way we expect it to work. Let's go ahead and refresh. Hello world, this is a title number 2. This is a paragraph number 2. And that is how we add HTML before and after an element. Now, what I would like you to do is the same thing. Just mimic what I've been doing in these videos just to get some hands-on experience. And again, and I can't say this enough, is when you're learning to code, you can watch as many videos as you like, but nothing is going to compare to actually getting some hands-on experience and being able to write it and to be able to create muscle memory. So go ahead and give this a shot. When you are done that, let's head on over to the next lesson where we actually select an element from the page and completely delete it. Let's take a look at how we can delete an element from a page. So for this, let's create a more complex example. Let's create a div, and it's going to have a paragraph in here, and it's going to have lorem in here. Then it's going to have another paragraph in here, some more lorem, and another paragraph in here with some more lorem. So we have 3 paragraphs in here. And let's say we wanted to select this middle one, class, middle, paragraph. And when we view our page, yeah, it's boring, but this is going to be a good example. So we have 3 paragraphs in here inside of a div, and one has a class. So let's go ahead and create an interesting selector here. But before we do that, let's make sure our jQuery can be loaded. Document.ready function. Spell it right for the 3rd time, function. And then we can put our jQuery in here. Let's go ahead and select this. Now there's a few different ways we can select this particular paragraph, but let's go ahead and select one in an interesting way, a way we haven't really seen yet. So let's select all divs on the page. Then let's select all paragraphs inside of the div. And then let's make sure that we're only selecting the paragraphs that have the class middle paragraph. Middle paragraph. So now we're getting into an interesting selector here. And to delete this, all we have to do is type .remove parentheses. And that will literally delete it from our document object model. So if we view our source code here, we have 3 paragraphs. This still shows up. But if I refresh the page, you can see that it doesn't show up. And if I go into my elements here, we only have 2 paragraphs. Neither of them have the class middle paragraph. Now what's cool about this is because this is a class selector, we can say middle paragraph. It's no longer the middle paragraph, but let's just pretend it is. We can select both of these at the same time and delete them at the exact same time. So now, It's going to select our div, select all paragraphs with a class of middle paragraph. Well, look, 2 of them are highlighted there. That's 2 of them. And we're going to delete both. So if we view our source code again, it still shows up as normal. There's still 3 paragraphs in there, but JavaScript is overwriting our page and it's getting rid of the other 2. And in here we have a div and a single paragraph. We don't have 3 paragraphs anymore. Now this is completely safe to do. This isn't going to ever delete or remove anything off of your computer. It's only ever going to work with code inside of your page based on the selector that you give it. Now if you wanted to, you could also just say, hey, select every paragraph, remove it. But because all of our paragraphs are in a div, we could select that div, we can remove that too. And we can see in our document object model that div doesn't exist. Our source code hasn't changed, but JavaScript is overwriting it. So what I would like you to do, as a fun little task, go ahead and create any sort of example with HTML, select a particular element, just one of them, and then remove it. Verify that it's been removed in here, verify it's been removed in here, and once you're done that, let's head on over to the next lesson where we select an element and then get rid of all of its children elements. So we're going to empty it out. There will be a time when you need to select an element and all of its children elements need to be removed. And so we could write some fancy selector to select pretty much everything. So we could say, for example, select a div and then select everything inside that div, dot remove. But there's a better way to do this. And so let's go ahead and set up an example here. We can say div, and this is going to be our parent element. So parent element, and this is an HTML comment here, right there. Let's write a strong bolded word here, italics, italicized word here. And let's also select, or not select, but create a paragraph with some lorem ipsum in there. And so if we view our page, okay, no big deal. We still have this div. What if we wanted to select this div, and let's give this an ID of parent. What if we wanted to select this parent ID div and get rid of all this stuff in here? That's really, really easy to do. And let's actually make this a little bit more complicated. So first of all, let's start off with div, select the parent ID, and then we could just do dot empty. And what this is going to do is select that ID, select that div, and just get rid of everything inside of it. Now we can chain together .html, and we could say something like, hello world. And that got rid of all of the elements inside of this div and replaced it with hello world. Now if we look at our source code, all of our regular source code is still there. This is not going to change throughout this course. All of our source code is going to be exactly as we write it. JavaScript will continue to overwrite it. So this is going to be exactly what we write, and JavaScript is going to change it. So from here on out, I'm probably not going to show you the source code too often anymore, just because, well, it's going to work the same way over and over and over again. Now, let's go ahead and sort of change this into proper JavaScript. So we can do const parent is equal to, and when you're writing jQuery and you see a $sign in front of a variable name, that usually means there's some sort of selector. So we could go ahead and select this. And then if we wanted to, we could say parent.empty or parent.html stuff in here. And we're going to see it says stuff in here. Now, what's sort of interesting about this is sometimes you just need to empty out an element just for something else to load a little bit later. But if you need it to happen right away, we actually don't need to use empty whatsoever. We can select this entire parent element and we can overwrite the entire HTML with a sentence that says stuff in here. Stuff in here, and there are no child elements. Now, if you're just coming into the world of document object models and you're like, what's a parent, what's a child? That's a good question. A parent element holds child elements. A child element is inside of a parent element. That's all it is. So let's go ahead and give this example a shot here, a little preview, and we're going to see in here we have actually overwritten all of it, so we didn't have to use .empty. Where .empty really comes in is if you have some processing to do, or if you need to fetch data from like an API, you could parent.empty, let's delete that, parent.empty, and then do a thing so you could like fetch some information from an API somewhere, and maybe that takes 3 seconds. And then you could say parent.html and put some new HTML in there. In the next lesson, let's start talking about event listener syntax, and how we can make something trigger when we click it. Welcome to the world of event listeners. Event listeners are very, very interesting things. So the first thing we need to do is look at syntax. Okay, so actually the first thing we need to do is talk about what an event listener is. An event listener is when you have a button on the page, let's say it says click me inside of it, and you click that button, what is supposed to happen? That is an event listener. Or if you have an input element and you start typing in it, every one of those letters that you press on your keyboard is an event. Anytime you move your mouse, anytime you resize your screen, anytime you focus into an input element or blur out of an input element or like leave the input element, these are all events, and we're going to be tackling a bunch of these in this course. So first things first, let's take a look at some of the syntax here. So there's two ways to do this. There's the right way, which you're going to see in the jQuery docs, and then there's arguably an even better way to do it, which is going to be future-proof to AJAX and document object model calls. So let's take a look at both. So first we have some sort of selector, and so we could like select the button, and then we can say .click, and this is going to take a function. And so without the function, this is what it looks like. That's an event listener. Now this function that we're passing in here is merely what we want to do. So we could say console.log, I am clicked. And because we have this button on here, on this page, it says click me. Let's go ahead and give this a shot. It says click me, and in the console here, every time I click it, it says I am clicked. That's it. That's all there is to event listeners with jQuery. It is super, super easy. Now there's another way to do this, and I'm going to comment this out. And arguably this way is better. You can have a selector, .button, and then you say .on. What do you want it to do? What do you want it to listen for? You want it to listen for a click event. And then you pass in a function. Console.log. This is clickable too. Refresh our page, and it says this is clickable too. Now, just to really make life crazy difficult and hard to learn jQuery, let's learn a third way. And this is actually the best way, but we're not going to do the best way. We're going to do the middle way moving forward throughout this course. But the best way is document.on, click, and then your button, and then your function, console.log, and let's just log 33333. And this works too. And so there's actually a reason we do it differently here. And so we're going to be using this method going forward just because it's the easiest to sort of write, to understand. And this one is a little more complex, but there is a reason that we do the complex way. The complex way is because what if we AJAXed or dynamically created a button? And let's go ahead and do this, and I'll show you an example here. Div ID, put a button here. Let's go ahead and select this. So we could do const, let's call it parent is equal to that selector. Nope, that's that ID selector. Then we can do parent.html. We can put a button in here. Click me / button. Button. And let's go ahead and get rid of the click me one. Say click me dynamic button. That's what this is going to be. Click me dynamic button. It shows up. There's no event listeners yet. Let's go ahead. And let's say this event listener was created first. So how JavaScript and jQuery is going to work is from the top to the bottom. It's going to select all the buttons on the page, and it's going to register a click function. But currently, at this point in time, there just aren't any buttons on the page. There's nothing to click. Then we selected that parent and put a button on the page. And when we save this and refresh, we see that nothing works. Now, that's fine if we can move this code below here, because this button is now going to exist on the page, and then we can register the event listener. And this is going to work. Now, that's not always going to be the case. There's going to be a lot of times where an event listener is registered, but then your page is going to dynamically change. And this is very, very, very common in modern websites. So what do we do? Can we use this option? Let's move this up, and let's comment this out so we know that it's not going to work. So we're now going to select a button and then on click, and we're going to say, when that button is clicked, console log, this is clickable too. Now the same problem is going to happen here. It's going to look for all the buttons on the page. It's going to try to register an on-click event. It's not going to work for us. Let's refresh the page and see that this button, every time I click it, doesn't work. Okay, so that's no good. This is nice, clean syntax. This is nice to write. It's not good enough for dynamic content. Dynamic content comes in here. And let's move this up. And so what this is saying is, select the entire document. When you click the document and you click the button, so it could be this particular button in here or whatever you want to give it an ID or a class or anything like that, this is your selector. Then do a function. And this is going to make your website dynamic proof, Ajax proof. So when things dynamically load on your page using other JavaScript, this is still going to work. And so let's go ahead and refresh the page. We see this now works. We registered a click event on all buttons, but we attached it to the document. So even if there is something dynamic happening, we can still execute this. So this is really good to know. Tuck this in your back pocket for now. But we're going to be writing this way moving forward just because it's a little bit cleaner. Now, what I would like you to do is create an event listener, something like this. Select a button, .on. Your first parameter is going to be, what are we looking for? We're looking for a click event. When you click the button, what happens? Then you write a function. This is called a callback function. And anytime you click this button, what is it going to do? Go ahead and give that a shot. Once you are done with that, let's head on over to the next lesson where we talk about moving our mouse over an element and off of an element. So we're going to hover. There is a way to register an event when you put your mouse over something and when you move it off of something. And for this, let's go ahead and write a little bit of CSS. So let's add some style in here and let's create a box. And it's going to have a width of 200 pixels, height 200 pixels, background color is going to be black. And let's put it in the middle of our page. Let's do margin 50% or 50 pixels top and bottom and right in the middle of the page. And so now we need to go and create a box and look at this. CSS, this is an ID for a box selector. Box. I can Emmet abbreviate that, so I'm not going to put any text in there. And then to select that box, all I have to do is write the exact same thing. And so now we're writing the same thing across basically 3 different scripting languages. We've got HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So now we can say .box on mouse enter. And what do we do when we put the mouse inside of this box? That's console.log. You entered. All right, let's say your mouse is hovering over this box. And so when we refresh the page, we have this black box, and every time I put my mouse over it, it says your mouse is hovering over this box. And so it only does it once while I'm on top of this box. And when I move out, nothing happens. When I move in, it happens again. Now to register when you move your mouse out, very, very simple. We can now chain these together, and we can say on mouse enter. We can also say .on mouse leave. Let's write a function here. And we can say console.warn you left the box area. And so all we're doing here is mouse enter and mouse leave. Now, as a quick little recap from the last lesson, because the last lesson was pretty intense, all we're doing here is some sort of selector dot on the event name and then a function, and that function will do whatever we want it to do in here. This is the event listener syntax. That's all it is. So just as a quick recap, we have a selector, because everything's based on selectors in jQuery, well, almost everything. On to register an event, whatever that event name is. In this lesson, we're using mouse enter and mouse leave. And then do a function whenever that event is triggered. Okay, let's save that and refresh the page. Okay, nothing is happening. I move my mouse in. Your mouse is hovering over the box. It says you left the box area. Every time we go in and out, in and out, in and out. Now, I'm going to be completely honest here. This was super popular a number of years ago, but people don't really use hover events anymore. We try to use hover events in pure CSS if possible. Sometimes that just isn't possible, so we can use jQuery, or we can use vanilla JavaScript as well to make this happen. But typically we try to stick with CSS to make any sort of event happen when you move your mouse over something or move your mouse off of something. And in CSS, it's as simple as saying box, hover, and then it does a thing. And when you move your box, or when you move your mouse off of this box and it's no longer hovering, it goes back to its default. So that's all it is, and that's why we prefer CSS. But again, sometimes that's not possible, and sometimes we need to write a little bit of JavaScript, a little bit of jQuery to make that possible. Go ahead and give this a shot. I want you to do two things here. I want you to select some sort of element and register a mouse enter event and just console log it. We don't have to do anything fancy yet. We'll get into the fanciness a little bit later, but just console log something. And then when you mouse leave, console log or console warn something else. And then part two is I want you to chain these together. So currently, we know that it can look like this. I'm just going to select that. Bump that inwards. So this works. This will work perfectly fine. But I want you to chain them together to make little nicer jQuery code. It's also a little bit more performant. It means your browser doesn't need to look up this particular element or this particular selector more than once. It can do it just once and use it over and over again. Once you're done that, in the next lesson, we are going to be talking about the key up event listener. So what happens when you type in some sort of input element, you type something in there, how do we get that value out of there? What happens every time you press a key on your keyboard? We're going to talk about that in the next lesson. Let's talk about the key up event. In the key up event, we have like an input, and let's give this a class of select me and a default value of thing here. No. Hello world. I like that better. And so we need to select this by its class, or, we could select it by its attribute, we could select it by its element type, we could select it by all sorts of things, but let's go ahead and select it by its class. Then we can say dot on key up function console.log you pressed a key. And so let's go ahead and refresh our page, and when we go in here, every time I press a key, it logs something in my console. You can see I'm spamming it down here. And that's all there is to it. And so at this point, if you're thinking, wow, Caleb, this is just like the same thing over and over again, you're absolutely right. It's the nice thing about jQuery is once you learn one thing, it's very similar to all the other things. And so it makes learning jQuery really easy. It also makes writing JavaScript really easy. Now let's say you wanted to get the value out of this. This is going to get very interesting. So let's actually delete that. And how do we get this value? We have two ways we can get this value. We can say const, let's do input is equal to the select me. And then we could do console.log, and we can log that input.val. Now we already know about val, so this is going to work for us. Let's go ahead and refresh this. And so it works for us the way we expect it to work. The problem here is you now have one selector here, and every time you press a key on your keyboard, it's going to traverse your DOM. It's going to look through, let's say, 10,000 lines of HTML and try to find this. And believe it or not, even though it is pretty fast, browsers aren't really that fast. There's a lot of information to go through, and you want to be performant with your code, especially if you're trying to get a job as a web developer. So instead, what we do is we can, because we're using function, and if you're coming from JavaScript, whenever you use function, you have access to the this keyword, we can use selector this.val. And this val simply refers to whatever is being selected here. And so let's go ahead and console log this. Console.log this.val. And when I refresh, hello world, and this is working better, and it's technically faster, it's technically more performant. Now what happens if we have another input element with the same class name, and this one just has different text? Is it going to select both of these, and then when you do a key up on either one of them, is it going to get the value of both of them together, or is it going to get the value of just the one you're typing in? These are questions we need to ask ourselves. Let's go ahead and refresh, and hello world, 1, 2, 3. And let's go into the type in here, 1, 2, 3. So it is completely siloed from the other ones, which is really nice. Now behind the scenes, all it's doing is selecting all of these as nodes. So this is a node and this is a node, and it's registering the key up event on each of them. And so even though the selector is being fancy and selecting two things, our event listener behind the scene is actually registering a different event listener for each of these. And so they are completely separate from each other. Now, as a quick little recap, we have our selector. So we selected an input element here. We said .on, key up, that is our event listener. Then we have a function, and in that function, we just console log this.val. Now this is the key takeaway here. This, we're not using this.val because .val doesn't exist on the this keyword. We're going to throw in this into another jQuery selector and then use .val, because .val exists on the selector in jQuery, not in vanilla JavaScript. This is a jQuery thing. And so we need to wrap this in a jQuery selector. I would like you to give this a shot, and I want you to tinker around with the this property, the this keyword. It only works when you use a function. So if you're writing modern JavaScript and you use an arrow function, this may or may not work. I implore you to try this out, see what happens. But typically you want this element, and I'm saying this specifically, so this element is registered into this function, and then we use this keyword to tie it all together. Go ahead and give that a shot. Try creating a key up event listener. When you are done, let's talk about what happens when you click into an event, not into an event, into a particular input. So when I click into it, or when I click out of it, what happens? Let's register an event listener whenever we click into an input element. And instead of using an input element, let's use a text area. And let's use a different type of selector. So this is going to have a name of my text area. And when I view the page, it's just a text area. Nothing happens. Now this is going to work with an input area, an input element, just like it's going to work for a text area element. So first things first, let's go ahead and select this. Now we can select this by a text area, but we can also select this by an attribute. And we can say the attribute, and it starts like this, brackets, name is equal to my text area. And this is a different type of selector. This works in CSS as well. .on, focus, function, console.log, you focused into this text area. And so when we refresh the page, as soon as I click into it to type something, it says you focus into this text area. It's not a hover. Notice how it doesn't trigger when I put my mouse over it, only when I click into it. And so that is basically all there is to focusing. This is also going to work for an input. So we can do an input, and input doesn't have a closing tag, and it doesn't also have rows ID, or it could have an ID, but it's not going to have rows or columns. Let's select both of those and call it my input. And so now we're selecting an input by its name attribute. We're saying on focus, you focused into this input area. Let's go ahead and give this a shot, and when I put my mouse over it, nothing happens. When I click into it, it gets triggered. But when I type, it's not triggered. And so the only thing that's happening here is when I put my mouse over it and click into it, so I'm ready to type. Now, if you're wondering, where on earth would I possibly use this? Great question. You know when you're on an app and it asks you for like your email address or something and your keyboard is hidden? Well, you click into that section, or you put your thumb into that section, you tap it, and then your keyboard slides up. That is a very good example of an on-focus event. Please go ahead and give this a shot. Create a focus event. This is very, very similar to mouse enter, mouse leave, click, and so on. So this should start to feel a little more familiar to you. In the next lesson, when you're ready, let's talk about what happens when you leave an element. So we talked about when you focus in, what happens when you focus out. In the last lesson, we looked at what happens when you have an input and you put your mouse inside of it, and then you click, and then it's called focusing. You focus on that text area and you're able to type. What happens when you want to unfocus? So value is going to be unfocus on me. And what we're going to do here is just select this using a regular selector, dot on, and it's not called unfocus, it's called blur. And we give it a function, console.log, you blurred away from this input area. Okay, unfocus one me. That is a fun typo. Let's also change that. We now know that it's not called unfocus. Blur off of me. There we go. Blur off of me. When I click in, nothing happens because that's the focus event. When I click out of it, not when I move my mouse out of it, but when I click out of it, you can see that this outline goes away. When I click out of it, it says, you blurred away from this input area. And every time I do it, it's going to trigger over and over and over. Now, if you're thinking, hey, when is this going to be useful to me? This is a really good example of whenever you're typing in your address or someone types in a website URL and you want to work with that information. We could get the value here. We could say console.log this.val. Blur off of me, 123, 123, 123. And when I blur out, it says blur off of me, 123, 123, 123. And so now we can work with that information. Not on every key up, not when you focus on it, just when you're done typing, you can do something with it. And so as an example, we could do something like let website URL is equal to this.val. And then we can say if website URL.substring 04 does not equal HTTP, and we want to make sure that this is a website. So this is going to be some sort of website URL, so like www.facebook.com. But every website actually comes with HTTP. That's the HTTP protocol. And so we can now say the website URL is equal to, and we can use a template literal here, so we're using JavaScript ES6. We can do HTTPS :/ website URL. We're using backticks for the template literal. And then we can say this.val is equal to the website URL. And so what we're doing here is whenever you blur off of this, if you have any sort of text in there that doesn't start with HTTP, it's going to automatically add HTTP. And then it's going to change that value to that website URL. Now that website URL might not possibly change, it might possibly change. Who knows? It depends on what the user types. So let's go ahead and write this as an example. Let's go to facebook.com, and when I blur out of here, it automatically adds http://facebook.com. And the nice thing about that is you can do user validation for them now. So when you sign up on a website and it's like, what is your website or what is your email address? And it's like, you put mywebsite.com and it's like, oh, actually you need that HTTP before you can submit this form, before you can actually sign up. It's like, yes, I get it. But also, the developer can do that for us. And you as the developer can now do that for the user, making the user experience significantly better. And that all happens with the blur function or the blur event listener. Now, we talked about submitting a form just now. Let's go ahead in the next lesson and see how we can prevent a form from submitting. There's going to be a time in your life when you have a form and it's supposed to do something, but you actually have a button, type is equal to submit this form. And you have this button, and when someone submits the form, you want to do something. Maybe you want to disable the button. You can totally disable that button if you wanted to, so people can't click submit more than once. That's a very common thing. Or you can completely stop the form from submitting entirely. Let's do an input here, and let's do the value is equal. No, let's not do a value. Let's do a placeholder. Your name. And when we view the form, this is all it looks like. So it's going to ask for your name, and then you submit this form. Now, for this example, we're going to need to actually give this a name. Name is equal to name, and this is going to show up in our URL. So when I hit submit, we're going to see name is equal to. Let's put my name as Bob. And it says index.html question mark name is equal to Bob. It's whatever you put in there. It's going to be auto-filled in the URL. And that says be auto-filled in the URL. And so maybe we don't want that to happen. Maybe we want something else to happen. And what I'm going to do is zoom back in here. So what we can do is we can select this form, and then we can say on submit, and this is where it gets interesting. Function can take an event parameter, and we've actually been ignoring this the whole time, but every event listener has an event parameter. And we can say event.prevent default. And what this is going to do is say, hey, yes, a browser knows that a form is supposed to submit anytime you click the submit button. But when this form is submitted, it's going to execute this function first. And we're going to say, take that event, the submit event, and prevent it from doing its default thing. Prevent it from being itself. And so now we can say console.log form was not submitted. And I'm going to clean up this URL because we know that whenever we submit this form, that it automatically adds stuff to the URL. And maybe we don't want that. So let's go ahead and type Kyle as the name. Submit this form. You notice how the URL didn't change? The page didn't flicker, the page didn't reload, and it says the form was not submitted. Now, honestly, at this point in time, this is completely useless to you, because why would you want to prevent a form from being submitted? Well, you wouldn't. Maybe you'd want to disable the button, which we'll talk about down the road. Maybe you'll want to add a different class to the button so it looks different, so it looks like the form is submitted. Possibly yes. We'll talk about that down the road as well. But the most common use case is when you have a form and you want to prevent it, what you want to do is you want to grab that form and you want to serialize the data. And then maybe you want to do some sort of AJAX request. So the form should not actually submit to index.html or wherever you tell it to point to. JavaScript can overwrite that and tell it to make an AJAX request to some other place. Now, we don't know about jQuery AJAX yet, so we can't talk about that just yet. We're going to talk about that near the end of the course. But for now, just tuck this in your back pocket because you're going to need it. Whenever you submit a form and you want to prevent some default action, you're going to need to then grab the values from the input or the text areas or the select fields. You're going to want to grab that information and do something with it. And that's what event.prevent default does. Now, while we're on the subject of event.preventDefault, what we can do is, let's go ahead and select this button. We know that whenever we press this button, whenever we click submit this form button, that is going to submit that form. It worked for us before. Surely it's going to work again once we disable this JavaScript here. We can do the same thing with submit. So let's go ahead and select that button, button dot on. When we click that button, we're going to register a function. And because every function secretly has an event parameter, we can do event.preventDefault. And just as a heads up, you will often see event as E. So whenever you see function E, chances are in JavaScript we're talking about event. And we could console.log button is rendered useless. And let's refresh the page and submit this button. And it just says button is rendered useless. The form is not submitting. I can do this, and when I submit the form, if it actually submits, this should be refreshed, or it should be wiped clean. There should be nothing in here. But it's preventing the form from submitting. And why is it doing that? And it's because we said, take that button, whenever you click it, take that event, that click event, and prevent it from doing its normal thing. Prevent it from being a normal function ing button. So in this lesson, what I would like you to do is write an HTML form. When you submit it, prevent it from doing anything, and then comment that out like I did. And when you have a submit button, and remember that type of button cannot be button, it cannot be reset, it has to be submit. So when you submit this form by clicking the button, prevent it from doing its normal thing as well. There's two ways to prevent a form from being submitted. And also remember, when you submit your form here, when you prevent it from being submitted, typically what we do is we grab this information from like an input, text field, anywhere else, and we work with that information first, and then maybe we actually submit it using JavaScript, or maybe we don't. Maybe we send that information off to an AJAX or an API endpoint. Regardless, this is good to know, this is good to tuck in your back pocket, and event.preventDefault is very, very popular. You're going to see this everywhere, and this is actually, honestly, this is just JavaScript. This isn't even jQuery. So go ahead and give that a shot when you are done. Let's talk about hiding elements. Okay, let's talk about hiding elements. So first things first, I'm going to need to show you what I have on my page. I have this box on my page, and it's just a 100 by 100 black box. And this is the CSS for it. Width 100, height 100, background color is black. That's it. And then I've got a button, it says click me, and then I'm actually just applying the box using CSS here. And whenever we click this button, let's make this box hide. And so we need an event listener for this. Let's go ahead and select that button by its ID. It's called click me dot on click function. We can pass an E or event, do e.preventDefault if we wanted to. If this was in a form, this would be useful. Currently, this is not useful because it's not inside of a form, but if it was, this is a good measure to take. And then we can select that box. We can select that box. And you can see, because this is jQuery, VS Code is adding all sorts of things. We're not going to go through all of this. There's a lot in here, but what we want to do is select this box, and we want to hide this box. And that's all we're going to do. So when I refresh this page, boom, hides it. Gonna refresh again, and let's see what happens in our elements here. This box, right in here, this is important to pay attention to at the bottom here. It simply does display none. That's all it does. So if you want to hide certain things, you can do that with selector.hide. Now we simply wrap this in an event listener, in a click event listener. So we said, whenever you click that button, then select the box and hide it. We don't have to do that. We can do it right when the page loads as well. So when we load the page, you can see that it flashes because in our source code it shows up, and we know it's going to show up in our source code. It's going to flash, and then jQuery is going to kick in, and it's going to say, oh, actually, let's get rid of it. Let's hide it. we're not deleting it from the DOM. We're making sure that we can still access it later. So it's not being removed, it's not being deleted, it's simply being hidden. What I'd like you to do is go ahead and give that a shot, but I want you to write an event listener with it. Let's get used to writing event listeners because that's what jQuery is all about. It's all about event listeners. So write an event listener on a button. Whenever you click that button, hide the box. When you are done that, in the next lesson, we are going to go and make that box visible again. All right, so this is just taking off from the last lesson. This is the exact example from the last lesson. So we have a button and a box, and when we save and refresh the page, this is what we have here. Now, I'm going to make sure that this box is actually hidden by default. I'm going to use display, not block, but display none. That box doesn't show up. It's there, it's in the DOM, but it's just invisible. So what we can do is when we click this button, instead of .hide, we can do .show. And this is really important too. Let's keep an eye on this down here. Let's refresh this page. And down here, we're going to see display block. And so it automatically assumed it was a block element and went for display block. And so it just showed the element. And actually, I shouldn't say hide up here. I should say show element. Show that element. There we go. That's all there is to it. Nice and sweet. It's a lot like hide and show. So we have hide to hide something, and then show to show something. Now, as the full example, we could select ID, click me. That's going to select this button. Let's write the old way. We could do function, and this is just different syntax. We're using the .on syntax usually, but we can do a .click event here. Then we could select that box and not hide it, but we could show it. And it works for us every single time. Go ahead and give that a shot. When you are done, we are going to get into something a little more fun. We're going to start adding CSS classes to our elements. So when you click a button, we can add a class to the element to make it look a little bit different. Let's take a look at how we can dynamically add a class to an existing element. So I have some CSS up here, and let's get rid of that. I just have a box, width 100, height 100, background color black. Let's go ahead and change that class, or add a class rather, to change that background color to be, let's say, blue. So we could say there's a class called blue, and it's simply going to have a background color of blue. Now, I need this box element to actually exist. And in my jQuery here, I can simply say .box.add class blue. And before I do that, actually, let's go ahead and let's just work with classes for a little bit. Let's work with, instead of IDs, let's work with classes. So we've got class box, box, and let's change that to .box. So now when I refresh my page, my black box turns blue. Now you can kind of see that it flashes real quickly. But it's changing my box to be blue. And we can actually see this as a real example here is we can delete this in our DOM. And this is what it looks like by default. And all we're simply doing is adding blue to it. Now let's go ahead and wrap this in some sort of timeout. So let's do set timeout. And we could give this a function. And let's make it timeout 2 seconds. And then select the box and add the class blue. So when I refresh the page here, it's going to wait just 2 seconds, and then it's going to turn it blue. Now, if we want to write modern JavaScript, we don't need to use a function there. We can simply use an arrow function. That's going to do the exact same thing. Refresh, wait 2 seconds, it turns blue. We can also wrap this in any sort of event listener that we want. So we could say something like the button, when it's clicked, function, or because we don't need the this keyword, we can do an arrow function. And let's get rid of that and move that up. And because we have a button event listener, we need a button on the page. So let's go ahead and add that button. Button, click me. And when we click this button, it's going to select that box and add a class of blue. Let's go ahead and refresh, click, and something is not right here. And that's because I typed clicked. It's supposed to be click. So refresh, click, there we go. Refresh, click, it changes. Refresh, click, it changes. We could do all sorts of things here. We could change the width as well. So let's say width 100, and this is simply going to change the width to be 100%. And so we can add class blue. We can also add class width 100. And refresh, and it changes it to be width of 100%. I want you to give this a shot. Try this. This is going to be very, very important. You're going to be using this a lot in vanilla JavaScript as well as regular jQuery. So you're going to want to be able to add a class. You can add multiple classes by simply adding a space in there, and jQuery will figure it out and add those classes for you. Wrap that in an event listener. If you do not need the this keyword, I'm saying this like this. If you don't need that inside of your function, you can simply write an arrow function as well. It's just a little more performant, a little more modern JavaScript. And then you can select your box or your element, and then you can add a class of whatever your classes are. So you are going to need to know a little bit of CSS for this. If you don't really know CSS, that's okay. You can just pause the video here and copy what I have on my screen. I simply have a box class. I've got a blue class and a width-100 class. And all that's doing is going to be adding these classes. And again, when we inspect, we now have class box, blue, and width 100. Go ahead and give that a shot, and when we are ready, when we're nice and ready, let's go ahead and take this exact example and do the exact opposite, where we remove a class. Okay, in this example, let's go ahead and remove the blue class and remove the width class. And so what I have here is an element with 3 classes on it, box, blue, and width 100%. This is just taking off from that last lesson where we were adding a class. And this is my box, blue, and width CSS that we have right here. So now what I want to do is register 2 different click events. When you click remove blue from here, and when you remove the width 100 class. And so we can get a little bit fancy with this. So instead of selecting box multiple times, we can select it once. We can say const box is equal to, and we're just going to get the box itself as a class. And this is just a simple selector. We can also do const remove blue is equal to dot remove blue. That's going to select that button. And remove width is going to remove the width. And so these are just selectors. So I've selected the box, remove blue, and remove width. Now here what I want to do is when you click remove blue, select that box and remove this class. And we can do that quite easily. We can say remove blue dot on click function box.remove class. That's all it is, just the word remove class, and we want to remove blue. Let's go ahead and give this a shot, and when we remove blue, and as a better example here, down here we've got box blue width 100. We could do remove blue, and it gets rid of it for us. Then we can click another button and remove the width. And so what I'm doing with these consts here is instead of selecting box numerous times, so instead of having to select that and put it in there, I can select it just once because I really only need to select it once. And then in a second event listener, we can do the exact same thing. So we can say remove width dot on click. And because we don't need the this keyword whatsoever, we can do an arrow function, and we can say box.remove class width. And that's not going to be right. It's going to be width 100. We want to remove this class. Let's go ahead and refresh. When we remove the width, this is going to be a perfect box. When we remove blue, it is now black. And so that's really all there is. The only thing we really need to take away from this particular lesson is remove class. So go ahead, give that a shot, remove class, remove a class. and just try to make it work for you. Should only take you about a minute or two, and when you're ready, let's head on over to the next lesson where we actually toggle classes on and off, because right now we can't really easily detect if a class has a blue class or a width 100. We can't really detect if an element has those classes, rather. So what we can do is we can toggle them on and off with a very simple jQuery feature. In the last lesson, we created some sort of box and we gave it a width of 100%. In this one, we just have a perfect square, and what we want to do is toggle blue. So we want to, every time we click this button, get rid of the blue, and then click it again, and turn it blue, and click it again, and just toggle it on and off. And so we can do that by, first of all, creating a click event. So we want to select the toggle blue class, and that's just right up here. We want to select that button. Dot on, click, function, and because we actually don't need this keyword, we can do arrow function. Then we can simply say the box, which we've selected up here, toggle class blue, and that's it. And so if jQuery recognizes that there's already a blue class, it's going to take it off. And if it recognizes that there is not a blue class, it's going to add it. And so let's go ahead and give this a shot, refresh our page, and watch this down here where it says blue box. Every time I click this button, on and off, on and off, on and off, just like that. And that's all there really is. That's how we toggle a class on and off. Now, where is this applicable? Well, if you need to hide and show something, or if you want to make something act because of a certain other thing. And actually, as a better example, let's go ahead and get rid of this and let's create an input. We've got an input, and whenever we have this input, let's just select that. When we have this input and we key up, let's go ahead and check this value. And then if that value is a particular name, let's change the toggle, the class to blue. Otherwise, let's change it to not blue. So let's go ahead and get this value. So const value is equal to this dot val. Now you realize that I'm using this keyword here. So now we need to write function. We can say if value is equal to Caleb. We could say add class, else box.remove class blue. Now we're not really using toggle here in the sense that we're not using toggle function, but we are toggling classes by removing and adding them. And one thing we need to do is functions don't have arrow functions, it's just the function keyword. Let's go ahead and refresh our page here. And if I type Jacob, doesn't work. If I type Gully, doesn't work. If I type Caleb, boom, turns blue. And now I can toggle it just like this by typing really anything else. So that's two ways in which we can toggle based on different event listeners. Now what I'd like you to do is go ahead and try toggle class. You don't have to do this whole example here. This example is pretty big and not super relevant to this class, but make sure you go ahead and use the toggle class function here with a selector. So you could do box.toggle class blue. Go ahead and give that a shot. When you're done, let's go ahead and add custom CSS, not a class, but let's add custom CSS to an element. Let's go ahead and add custom CSS to a particular element. So in this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to grab this box and we're going to add CSS to it. We're not going to add a class. We're not going to remove a class. We're going to add dynamic CSS. So we can actually basically write style is equal to width 100%, for example. We can make that happen with JavaScript and jQuery. So first things first, we need to grab our box element. So let's do dot box. And all we have to do is type dot CSS. And this is really cool because we could do background color blue. And this syntax is a little interesting. So what we're doing here is we're saying dot CSS, the first value in this function is going to be what do we want to change? What CSS property do we want to change? And then we want to change that actual value. So we can change that to blue, but let's go ahead and change this to orange. And you can see that it actually loads black and then changes to orange. And you can see here, style background color is equal to orange. Now, if we check our source code, where are we? There is no style attribute on there. jQuery dynamically added that for us. Now, if we wanted to, we could do multiples. We could do .css, border, comma, 10 pixels, solid black. And that dynamically changed it for us. We could do another one. We could do .css, border radius, comma, 50%. And now it turns it into an orange circle with a black border instead of being just a regular black square. And this sort of leads us into animations a little bit, which we'll talk more about down the road. Now, there's a better way to do this. We could comment that out, and we could do .css, and we can give this an object. Now, when we give this an object, we don't type background color because objects aren't supposed to have dashes in their names. We do background, and then we camel case it, color. So look at the difference between this and this one. Background dash color versus background color with a capital C. And let's go ahead and change this to yellow. Let's change the border to 10 pixels solid blue. And let's change the border radius. Notice the capitalization there, and there's no dashes. Border radius to be 10 pixels. And so this is just a regular JavaScript object. Let's go ahead and save that and refresh. And look at that. We can change them all in one shot, or we can chain them together if we wanted to. Now, what I'd like you to do is try out both methods. Try chaining them together. So you've got the first one, and then you've got a second one, and then you've got a third one, and then comment those out. And basically, don't chain them together, just change them all at the exact same time. Because right now, jQuery has to go here, change that, read the styling, go here, change that, read the styling, go here, read that, change your styling. Versus going into this method, where we're just giving it all of it, we can just say, hey, jQuery, deal with all of it all at once. Instead of doing 3 different tasks, do one big task. Next up, we're going to learn about how to fade things in and fade things out. Let's take a look at how we can fade an element in and fade an element out. So in this lesson, I'm going to use my console. And this is a cool little thing, because in my code here, I'm using a CDN. I have access to that little $sign. That means jQuery, that little $sign. And so I can select this box. I can say const. Yeah, let's do const box is equal to, and give it a selector. And when I type $box, it gives me this box. That's the entire element. It's actually a list of nodes technically, but there's only one in there, so we can work with just the one. It's totally fine. Now, to fade something in and out, all we have to do is box fade in. Actually, it's already faded in. Let's fade out, and it fades out. We could also do box fade in, and it fades in. We can also give it a timeout, or not a timeout, but a timer. How long should this take to fade out? Let's say this is going to take 4.5 seconds. So we do 4,500, that's milliseconds, that's 4.5 seconds, fade out, and it's going to slowly fade out. We can do the same thing with fade in. Fade in, slowly fades in. And there's actually another cool thing we can do, is we can give this a callback function. We'll talk about callback functions a little bit later, but we can tell it to do something when it is done fading in, when it is done fading out. So what I want you to do is don't write your code necessarily in your editor this time. Go ahead and just open up your console. You can always right-click, inspect, click the console tab, select your box like what we did. We've got const box is equal to that box. And then we did box.fadeout, box.fadein. Give that a shot. Once that is working for you, let's head on over to the next lesson where we learn how to toggle a fade and toggle a display. Let's go ahead and toggle a fade effect and a display effect. So we need to do two different things here. Before anything, we need some sort of event listener. Click me. And it's just a simple button. So let's go ahead and register this button as a click event. Button dot on click function. And that's how we register the click event listener. Then we need to select that box, and we can do toggle, and we can do fade toggle. And this is either going to fade in or fade out depending on how visible it is. So let's go ahead and give this a shot. When we click this, fades in, fades out, just like that. And we can see here there's a style attribute, and watch it. When I click this, it's going to fade out. It changes the opacity down to 0, and then it changes the display to none. And when it fades back in, it changes the opacity, it scrolls it back up to 1 or 100%, and makes it display block, or actually just gets rid of the display property altogether. We can see it's display none, and it's going to be whatever I told it to be before. So if it's inline block, it's going to be inline block. If it's display block or flex box, it's going to be flex box. It's going to be whatever we set it to be in CSS. So we can fade toggle. The other thing we can do is simply toggle. This is going to toggle it to display or to not display. So simply, just like that. That's all we're doing. We're clicking it, and every time we click it, it either makes it visible or makes it invisible. That's all it's doing. Just as a recap, toggle is going to basically use hide and show, whereas fade toggle is going to use fade in and fade out. Go ahead and give that a shot. Try fade toggle and try regular toggle. These are going to be useful when you create interactive websites for people. When someone clicks something, does it become visible? If they click out of it, does it become not visible? Like a menu system, like a drop-down menu system. When you click the little icon that suggests that you could have a menu and it drops down, then maybe you want to toggle. So there are a lot of different ways in which we would use this. Now, honestly, fade in and fade out is not used too often anymore, just because it looks a little bit cheesy. But you know what? Maybe a couple years from now, the whole web, the whole internet decides fading in and fading out is a thing that we want to do again. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and talk about sliding up and sliding down as another form of animation. Okay, let's talk about sliding up and sliding down. Real easy here. This is a lot like fade in and fade out. So I have a button here. It's registered as a click event, and I want to slide this box up and slide it down. So like an FAQ question, a frequently asked question section on a website, an FAQ. So we could select this box whenever the button is clicked, and we could say slide down, or we can say slide up. So let's first of all slide up. Slide up is going to hide it. Refresh, it slides it up. Pretty neat, right? We could also do slide down, which is just going to slide it down and make it visible. Or we can slide toggle, and that's going to toggle it to slide up and slide down. So let's go ahead and refresh. Up, down, up, down. So this is a nice short lesson. Honestly, at this point, you probably don't need to practice this anymore. Just keep this tucked away in your back pocket. Slide toggle. You can slide up and you can slide down. You're going to use this one more than a fade in and fade out for sure. So if you want a little bit of experience, yeah, definitely go and create an example like this. You can even just steal my example here. Otherwise, let's head on over to that next lesson where we talk about callback functions. All right, let's talk about callback functions. In a callback function, really all a callback function is a function, a little piece of code that should run after something is done running. So for instance, we have a selector here, and we said register a click event listener, and anytime that's supposed to run, execute this function. That's a callback function. So once a click happens, do a thing. We can also select our box from our previous lesson, and we could say something like fade out, And we could give this a parameter. Let's say it's going to take 1.5 seconds. And then we could give this a function as well. And this is a callback function. And so we gave it a parameter, how long it should take, comma, function, and then just a regular function here. And then we can say console.log fade out is complete. Let's go ahead and give this a shot, and let's go to our console here. It's going to fade out. Fade out is complete. And we can do this with a lot of different things. We could do fade out. We could do slide up. It says fade out is complete. That should have said slide out is complete, but regardless, the callback function still works. And so really all we're doing here is, if we simplify this a little bit, we're saying select the box, slide up, take 1.5 seconds. When you're done that, console log fade out is complete, or slide up is complete. We can do this with a lot of different animations. So we've got slide, we could do fade. We could use it with toggles as well. So let's do toggle fade. It's going to take 1.5 seconds to fade in or fade out. And fade effect is complete. And so let's go ahead and click this. Oh, something is not right here. It's not toggle fade. It is fade toggle. I get that backwards every now and then. And so all that did was automatically fade out because it was already visible. Now let's wrap this in a click event listener. Select that button, dot on, click function. And you see I'm going pretty fast here. It gets a lot easier over time. And you can see this starting to be a pattern in jQuery. We have a selector, do a thing, a function, selector, do a thing right there, a function, a selector, do a thing, a function. And let's go ahead and get rid of this 1500 milliseconds, or the 1.5 second fade in, fade out. Let's just give this a shot. Click it, fades out, fade effect is complete. You can see it right down there. Perfect. Look at that. That is working exactly the way we want it to work. Now, a callback function is really useful. If something is faded out, maybe you want to then remove it. So let's do this. Let's do fade out, and we can do this dot remove. And so once this is faded out, because right now you can see that if we click this, it's going to fade out. It's still actually in our DOM. Maybe we want it to be completely removed for whatever reason. We could click this, and you notice that it actually completely removed itself from the document object model. So see this down here? Watch that. It disappears. It becomes completely removed. And now we can't click this. It's rendered useless. So if you need a one-time event, that is a good way to do it. Now, you actually don't need to practice anything with callback functions. We have been writing callback functions this entire time. So a little bit of a surprise there, callback functions. You are pretty much a grandmaster wizard at callback functions at this point in time. In the next lesson, let's talk about adding our own animations. All right, let's talk about animations. In jQuery, we can animate certain things and we can not animate certain things. So anything that has a number value, we can animate. So a width of 500, for example, is a number value. And we can animate that down to 400, 300, 1000 if we wanted to. A color is not necessarily a number. It is a mix of numbers and letters. It's like black is 000000, or FFF, FFF, and that's white. We could do an off-white, F5, F5, F5. And a computer simply just doesn't really know, natively how to scroll this up to FFF, FFF, or down to 000000. But if you have a width of 500, well, that's just simply decrementing. You could change it from 500 to 400 by going to 499, then 498, 497, 496, 495, etc., etc., etc. There is a linear order of operations here. So let's go ahead and animate our box. So when we click this button, we've got a button up here that says click me, registered click event. Let's select that box and animate it. So we could do something like .box animate. And this is going to take an object. And so in here we could say the opacity is, currently it's 1, we could change that to like 0.5. The width is currently set to 100 pixels. And just because it says pixels doesn't mean it doesn't know how to work with a number. It knows how to split this and say, okay, the width is currently 100, and it's also pixels. So let's change that to like 500. 500 pixels because we need the measurement in there. Let's go ahead and refresh. Look at that. And it animates nicely. It's nice and smooth. It works perfectly for us. Now, if we wanted to, we could slow this down as well. We could say animate this over 4 seconds or 4,000 milliseconds. And it takes its time, just like that. Now, what's not going to work is if we wanted to change that background color. If we wanted to change that background color to blue, it simply doesn't know how to go from black to blue. Like, what is the definition, or what is the function, or what is the linear logic behind changing one color to another color and making it look animated? Like, does it go from black to red to blue, or from black to purple to blue, or from black to white to blue? Like, a computer just doesn't know that. But a computer knows how to work with hard numbers quite easily. So we're going to see that changing the background color here to blue is simply not going to work. It's going to fade out. It's going to be a gray. That's absolutely not blue, though. Your task for this lesson is to select an element and animate it. We can get rid of that. You can give it an object with what you want to change to its value. So width, height, opacity, anything like that. Even your font size if you wanted to. And then give it some sort of duration. How long should this take? For me, I said it should take 4 seconds. For you, maybe you want it to take 1 second or 20 seconds. Or maybe you want it to change to be completely see-through by the time it gets to 100%, and this should take 5 seconds. We could do something like that too. This is one of those times where it's good to have some fun. Just tinker around with it. And you don't have to do anything in particular. You just need to make sure that it changes something with a numeric value. And again, we're using CSS here. JavaScript, CSS, and HTML all work very well together. They're all designed to work with each other. And also, keep in mind, you can only work with actual hard numbers. 100% is a number. Blue is not a number. Go ahead, have some fun with that. In the next couple of lessons, let's talk about width dimensions and height dimensions. Let's talk about height dimensions. So we have this thing called a document object model. And when we right click on that box and, we select it over here, we come on down, we can see that we've got margin, border, padding, and the actual size of the element itself. We can check to see what that sizing is. So we can select that box. Let's do const box is equal to dot box. And then we can do box dot. We've got a few different things. We've got outer width and width. So if we take a look at the width here, which is actually a function. So whenever you see this little curly F here, that usually means it's a function. That typically means that you simply forgot your parentheses. So my box width is currently 100. And let's go ahead and see if I can pop this out. There we go. We can also do the box height is also 100. We can do the box outer width is 100. We can also do the box inner width is 100. And we're going to see that all three of these things are the same, but they're actually different. And this depends on the box model. And so if we go back here, and what I want to do is add some padding. 100 pixels. No, let's not do 100. That's a lot. Let's do 20. And let's do a margin of 20 pixels as well. And we're going to see that this bumps the element. And actually made the element look a little bigger. So now if I go back up, select my box, I could do box dot width. It's now 100. That's the inside. The inside is 100. And we're going to see if we go over to elements. that inside here is 100. Now let's do box.inner width. It's 140. Well, where did we get 140 from? If we go back to elements, we can see that there's a padding here. This is the entire box itself, the inner width of the box. So we've got 100, and then we've got 20 on either side. So 100, 120, 140. That's where we got 140 from. Now we can do the outer width as well, box.outer width. Now we're looking at the outer width here, and that outer width has two options here. So we've got regular outer width, and this is the outside here. Or we can do outer width true, and what that's going to do is take all of it, including the margin. So we've got 100, 120, 140, 160, 180, and that's where we're getting 180 from. Now, what I would like you to do for this particular lesson is don't worry about the width, inner width, or outer width. What I want you to do is do the same thing with height. So grab your box element and then do inner height, or just height, or outer height, and try it with true in there. Give that a shot and try it with different sizes. Make your box a different size. It doesn't have to be a perfect square either. And then what I want you to do is I want you to select your entire window. That is your entire viewport. And then do width and height. Now, just as a heads up, my height is very low just because I am super zoomed in here. If I wasn't zoomed in, this would be significantly higher than 289. Go ahead, give those a shot. These are important when you're working with positioning things on your page using JavaScript, so you are going to need to know how these work. When you're done that, let's head on over to the next lesson where we talk about a new event listener where it checks to see if we're resizing our page at all. Let's talk about resizing the window. At this point in time, we've always had some sort of selector in a set of quotations, like our box. But we can also set a selector to be your window or your document. And so for this, we want to see the viewport changing. Now that viewport is this entire white area. How big is that exactly? And we sort of looked into this in the last lesson when we did box.outer width, box.inner width, and then window.height, window.width, things like that. So what happens when we resize our page? Well, we can take different actions based on different window sizes. So let's go ahead and do window.on resize function console.log, and then we want to console.log the window width. This is why I got you to do this in the last lesson. Window.width by window.height. And so let's open up our tools here and let's redock this. And refresh the page. And anytime I move this, you can see that those numbers are changing. And so the height isn't changing, but the width is changing. The width is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And so now we can do something based on this. We can say if the page width is less than, let's say, 230, change the background color to black. Now, this isn't a very ugly example, but this is a good practice example. So let's go ahead and get rid of that. And we can say if the window width is less than or equal to 230, we now know that we can change the body.css background color to be black. Otherwise, we can do the same thing and change the background color to white. All right, so this is going to stay black, or white rather, until it gets down to 230. 230, there we go. And it's going to toggle, just like that. Now we can do the same thing based on height as well. And I'm just going to put that console log back in here, where we're going to log the width and the height. And I'm going to change where this is docked. Change that to the bottom here and refresh the page. Refresh. And now when I resize, we're going to see the width isn't changing, but the height is changing. And we could take some sort of action if someone's page is, for example, only 87 pixels tall. Do something else. You could give them a warning. You could literally delete everything from your document object model and just say, hey, your browser is way too small for this website. In fact, your browser, if it's 87 pixels tall, is way too small for any website. And that is how we resize the window. Now, it's not actually super useful at this point in time, and I haven't used this in a number of, probably a number of years, but it is good to know because sometimes I run into old code that's doing this, and then I just convert it over to CSS media query to make it responsive. And this is sort of where CSS starts to take over for JavaScript, but sometimes you need to know this in JavaScript as well. Especially if you're going to be creating a game of some kind. If you're going to create a game, you're going to want to know what the dimensions are of the game, the viewport, the game portal here, this whole white section. You're going to want to know what that size is and work with it. All right, welcome back. Let's talk about looping through elements. And so when we have a selector of some kind, some sort of element, this could be one element or this could be multiple elements. And a good example of that is if we have like an unordered list with an li in here, first item, second item, third item, and we select all of these li's. What if we want to do something different with all of these li's, but we still want to select all of them? We want to select each of these three list item elements. Well, if we did li.text, this is going to change it on all three of them. And sure enough, it did. That's not what we're looking for whatsoever. Maybe we want to do something different for each of them, but we want to use one selector. So we could either do li, grab the first one. We can do a selector like this. We could do first, we could do last, or we could loop through all of these and do something different based on one selector. And sometimes looping through is the right way to do things. It's just a faster way to do things. So we can say dot each, and this is going to take a function, index, and the element. And that element itself is going to be this whole element in here. And that index is going to be, is it the first iteration, second iteration, third iteration? So we can now say the element itself, which is a lot like saying this, which we've used before, but this is just referring to this particular element in this loop. Dot text is going to be index new item here. And so when I refresh the page, you can see it says 0 new item here, 1 new item here, 2 new item here. Now, if you're somewhat new to JavaScript and you're like, well, why does it say 0? It's because computers technically start counting at the number 0 instead of the number 1. We could always do index plus 1 just to offset that. There we go. New item here, new item here, new item here, 1, 2, 3. If we view our source, it's just the old stuff that we had. It's not the new stuff. Now we could say something like if the index is equal to 2, select this element, change that CSS to have a background color of black. And then we can chain these together. We've done this before. Change the color to be white. So we'll just invert the colors. And it selects this one here. Remember, 0, 1, 2. Now we don't have to do it with just LIs either. We can do it with divs. Let's go ahead and change these two divs. It's going to grab every div on the page. It's going to loop through them. It says first item, second item, third item. Something went wrong there. Oh, because I didn't change my selector. There we go. 1 new item here, 2 new item here, 3 new item here. We could even get fancier with this, and we could keep its original text. So we could say something like const original text is equal to this element dot text, and we'll throw that in here as a variable, original text. And so now we have it numbered, first item, second item, third item, with a dynamic number in there. Now, if we wanted to, we could do anything ridiculous with this. We could multiply this by 3. Oop, 3, there we go. So we get 0, 3, 6. We can do anything we want. That's just working with the index. The element itself, you can do anything with that element, and it's just a regular selector. So just remember, when you're using .each, it takes 2 elements, or not elements, but parameters. Your first one's going to be the index. Where in the loop iteration is this? Is it the first iteration, second iteration, third iteration, etc., etc.? And the second parameter is your element. And your element, you can then use the selector, which is a lot like saying this, but we're not really inside of the function. We don't want that to be part of the function. We want the element itself. So we select that element, and then we can work with it. And it's going to do it for every single div that it can get its hands on, or every li, or every class selector, anything. What I would like you to do here is go ahead and give this a shot. I want you to select an element that has multiple elements on the page. Do .each, function index element, and then I want you to either change the text or work with the index or select that element at least and change some of the CSS so that you know that it's working. Let's talk about changing element attributes. And I have a really good example lined up here. So let's say we have an input element and we want to change this from text to password. And so the idea here is we can write something like this, but what if we wanted it to actually look more like this, like password, password, password and stuff? We can do that quite easily. So let's go ahead and select this input. Let's do const input is equal to, and then just the input. It's the only one on the page, so I don't have to worry about getting specific with it, with the selector. Then I can say the input dot attr, that stands for attribute, attr, text, not text, type. And so let's console log this, console.log this type. And this should say, if we do it right, text. And let's bring that up. There it is, text. Or if we did 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Yep, same thing. Cool, 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 cool. But what if we wanted to change it? So this is a lot like val or text or .html. And what I'm saying here is .val, .text, .html. It does one of two things. Either you give it a parameter or you set a parameter. And so we're saying simply get the type attribute. This is our parameter. It's just getting the type here. That matches that. Now, if we wanted to change that, we could. We could say attr type and then change it to password. And this is going to happen so fast, and it sort of looks like it's going to happen behind the scenes, but when I type like this, after I refresh the page, it's going to look like a password field, like this. Now, what's kind of cool is if you want to see my password, I can simply select input .attr type, and let's change that from a password field to a text field. And you can see my password is in plain text now. My password is awesome. So that's how we get an attribute, and that's how we set an attribute. And just as a quick little reminder, to get an attribute just takes one parameter, just like that. And if it has a second parameter, it's going to try to set that attribute. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and start working with some Ajax stuff. Ajax is really, really fun. It's working with APIs. We're getting into some good JavaScript here, some real fun stuff, more production level stuff, more professional kind of JavaScript that you're going to be writing using jQuery. All right, let's look at Ajaxing some data with a little bit of a callback. Now, we need a place to get data from. And one of my personal favorites is swappy.dev. This is a Star Wars API. And if you go to swappy.dev/API/people/1, you're going to see this information about Luke Skywalker. And so we can actually go there, swappy.dev/API/people/1. And we see all this information about Luke Skywalker. Now this is the URL we want. This is an API endpoint. We want to be able to get this information, this JSON information, and access it quite easily. So what we can do here is if I just move this up, actually no, let's undock this. is we have access to jQuery in here with a $sign. You can see that. We can use .get and then that URL. Now, if we do just that, we're going to see that it's just a regular AJAX request. But if I clear that out and give it a callback function, we know about callbacks, we know about functions. Let's do console.log the data. And we're going to see that this is the AJAX request here, and this is our data. And so we're doing a GET request here. We're simply asking for data. And so by using $.get, there's no selector here because we're not selecting anything. And because there's no selector, we don't have a selector. It's just $.get. And so now we have all this information loaded on our page, or in our console at least, that was available over here. Name Luke Skywalker, height 172, mass 77. Height 172, mass 77, name Luke Skywalker. It's all the same information. And so that's how we do a simple AJAX request in jQuery. Now what's wild about that is this is so incredibly simple. We could do .get, and I just pasted that URL in there, the data, and then we can console.log data name. That was what we're looking for, right? Name. So let's go ahead and save this, and let's just refresh this page, and it goes and gets it. It says Luke Skywalker. We could get his height. We could get his weight if we wanted to. Luke Skywalker, 172. Weight wasn't in there. It's called mass, that's why. His mass is 77. And so now we don't have to worry about like a fetch API request. We don't have to worry about taking that data and basically parsing the JSON and turning it into a JSON or a JavaScript object. We don't have to worry about any of that because jQuery is doing all of that behind the scenes, and it does it with a single line of code with the .get function. Now you're going to need to know this for your final project, so I highly recommend that you give this a shot. Try it out. All right, in the last lesson we looked at a jQuery GET request. And in this lesson we're going to look at a jQuery POST request. And this is how we send data to a server and ask it to update data or create some new data. And so this is really, really simple too. It's just .post and then some URL in here, some data in here, and a callback function with the data that's going to be returned. That's literally all it is. So your data should be an object of some kind. So we could say, hello world. And that URL, we need somewhere to post to. And it's really, really hard to find a place to safely post to, but I found one called http bin. So we do this as the URL, https://httpbin.org/post. And if we want to, we could put these on separate lines just to make this look a little nicer. And then we can say console.log post was complete with this data. Console.log data. Post was complete with this data, and let's take a look. This is all the data that we got back, and httpbin.org tends to give us all of our data back in the form property here. So it says hello world. We could put anything in there though. We could say Instagram is equal to @coding.for.everybody, which if you want free coding tips and tricks, definitely come check this out. And form, Instagram, coding for everybody. And so we know that that is actually working. Now, if we want to make sure that it's not working, we can always just try get. We'll do .get, and we'll do it, we'll create a GET request to the /post URL. And you can see 405, that means not allowed. You're not allowed to do that. It has to be a POST request. So go ahead and give this a shot. Use httpbin.org. Don't forget you need HTTPS. You might run into that error if it's coming from an unsecure location to a secure location. Just make sure you have that S in there. This is called your payload. This is the data that you're going to be sending them. And then you've got a callback function. When it's done, what are you doing with that data? All we're doing here is we're doing console.log data. Now this is really, really useful when you're creating a single page application or a progressive web app where you need someone to register or log in and you don't want to take them to another page, or you have an API endpoint, or they have to log in through a different website, something like that. You can send that data somewhere else for processing, and that data can come back usually in the form of JSON, and then jQuery can handle it very gracefully. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and create a random Star Wars character generator based on pretty much everything we have done in this course. Okay, welcome to your final project. We are going to be creating a random Star Wars character generator using jQuery and JavaScript. So, what I want you to do here is go to this URL here. I'll zoom in so you can see this. I want you to go to this URL here, and we can see all sorts of stuff. We don't want roots all. We want an ID. So let's go to ID, and we can go to, for example, /Star Wars API /API /ID 1.json. We get Luke Skywalker. We also get an image and a wiki and all sorts of other stuff in there. We could go to character. I think there's only 83 in here. Yeah, this one doesn't have as much information, but at least he's got a name and an image, which is really all we want at this point. Let's go to 84. Oh, there is one. There's a bunch of new information in here, I think. But there's not 100 characters. There's not 100. Let's see if there's 90. Let's see if there's 87, 88, 89. This is important that we do this. Okay, there's 88 characters. So we need to randomly get a number between 0 and 88 and go to this URL and replace 88 with a random number. And then on our page, I want you to be able to show the name of the person and their image. And so we're going to need to work with some inner text. We're going to need to work with changing an attribute. We're going to need to work with a GET request and some random numbers. Now, I want you to, if you can, if you know enough JavaScript, try to do all of this on your own at this point in time without watching me do my solution. Now, if you get really, really stuck, first of all, definitely go and Google. Half of web development is Googling stuff. But if you get stuck on Google and you don't know where to go, you can always come to the Learning to Code Facebook group, or simply resume this video once I fade out and fade to black, and then you can watch me do my solution. So I want you to go ahead and give this a shot. It can look like anything you want, by the way. This is completely up to you. Make it look amazing if you want. Make it look terrible if you want. That is 1000% up to you. Go ahead and create a random Star Wars character generator based on the very little information that I have given you. And I've purposely given you very little information here because this is going to be very good practice as a professional web developer. People are going to give you very little information and you're going to need to work with it somehow. So I'm going to fade out and then I'm going to fade in, and you can watch my solution later. So just make sure you pause when the screen goes black. Okay, let's go ahead and create a random Star Wars character generator. So the first thing I'm doing here is I'm looking at my API endpoints and I'm reading through it. This is very important to read through it. Don't just take someone else's word like my word from earlier. Actually read through it if you can. So we have a base URL or a cached CDN URL. Let's go ahead and use this cached CDN URL. We have two routes. So we can use this URL /all.json or /ID. So let's go ahead and do /1. Is this going to work for me? Nope, that's not going to work for me. It's got to be /1.json probably, right? Nope, that's not going to work either. Okay, so that wasn't working. So we read through this and we see that this says ID, but it should actually say ID and then the number.json. So documentation could be slightly better here, but we see an example of it here. So let's go ahead and put that URL in here and do /ID /1.json. We get Luke Skywalker. Now, how many characters are there? What's our maximum number? Our maximum number is going to be 89? Nope, that's not going to be right. It's going to be /ID /88.json. There we go. Captain Phasma is the last character we have. So we have numbers 1 through 88, which we can work with. So let's go to our code here and let's create a button. And it says generate character. And we need to, when this button is clicked, .on, click, do a thing, function. So that's just registering a regular click event. Now we need to do some sort of get request. We can do .get, and then that URL. And so I have this URL in here, and I'll make that just a touch smaller, as just 88.json. Whatever that's going to be, just return that. That's fine. We can change that later. And then we want to get that data and console.log the data. We just want to make sure that this is going to work for us on our browser. So let's go back to our browser and refresh our page, generate character, and it did. It got Captain Phasma. It got our information in here. That's perfect. But now we need to randomize it, because if we click it again, it's just going to keep getting Captain Phasma. So let's go ahead and randomize that number. Now we need to create a random number, and this is not jQuery, this is just JavaScript. So we can do const random number is equal to math.random, and this is going to give us a number between 0 and 1 times 88, and that's going to give us a number between 1 and 88. And then we want to do math.ceil. And so what random is going to do is it's going to actually give us a weird number. It's going to be like 0.01234556. It's going to have a bunch of decimals. We don't want that. What we want instead is whatever that number is multiplied by 88 and then bump it up to the closest highest number. So if it's like 74.1, it's going to now be 75. And let's go ahead and change this to a template literal. This is just regular, plain old JavaScript at this point. And we're going to put random number in here. Let's go ahead and save that and refresh our page, generate a character. Oh, random number is not. I had a typo somewhere right there. Okay, let's try this again. Who are we getting? Chewbacca, ID 13. ID 19. ID 21. These are all low numbers, strangely. ID 64, there we go. So now we need to get their name and their image. So we've got all sorts of stuff. We've got like when they're born location, yada yada. We want their name, like Palpatine, and an image. So let's just scoot this down just a wee bit. And let's go ahead and put a name in here. So let's do h1 name. Let's just leave it empty. And let's select an image. SRC is going to be nothing as well. Let's give this a class of character, img. And let's go ahead and work with some of this. So now we know we can fill name with data name. Data name. And that's accessible when I click in here. This is all the data in an object. I can scroll on down to name. So now I can select that name. I can do h1.name.text is going to be data name. And so we see nothing. Boom. 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 Look at that. It is working so nicely right now. Let's go ahead and add an image as well. And let's zoom out because we are at like 250%. That's getting just to be too much. Now we can select that image. We can select the character, img. We can select that attribute of src and set it as what? We have what in here? If we look at it, it is just called image. So we do data img. Okay, let's see if this works. Okay, I have no idea who that is, but cool. Cool. All right. Yeah, this is looking pretty good. So basically, we have this working now. Now we can make this a little bit nicer if we wanted to by adding a little bit of styling. So we could do something like style. We could select our H1, text align center, text decoration, underline, font family. Let's do a sans serif font. Doesn't really matter what the font is, just a sans serif font. And let's generate character name underneath that. Let's do button. Display is going to be block. Margin is going to be auto. This should be centered. There we go. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Let's go ahead and style that image a little bit. We can do IMG. Width is going to be, let's say, 200 pixels. The height is going to be auto. Box shadow. 10 pixels, 10 pixels. Let's give it a little bit of a blur. And let's make it black. Now let's see what this looks like. Oh, that image didn't show up. It probably doesn't have an image. Okay, not bad, not bad. Let's go ahead and center that as well. Let's do display, block, margin, auto. Character generator, Greedo, character generator, Dudbolt, character generator, all sorts of people in here. Look at these. And so that is our random character generator. That is a terrifying photo. And we did that technically in about 7 lines of code. Yeah, somewhere around there. So we got, oh, am I mathing wrong? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 lines of code. So we have our event listener. Whenever you click the button, randomly get a character. Randomly create a character, or a number rather, randomly create a number. Get, and then just the URL, that's that API URL. And instead of getting like 88.json or 1.json, we just said every time you click that button, create a new random number and put it in here. Then when it's done, we have a callback function, and we're simply getting the name and the image, and we're setting that H1 name and the character image attribute, the src. That's all there is to it. Now, mine is pretty ugly. If you want to take my code and make it significantly nicer looking, please be my guest. I would love if you could do that. Don't forget to share your project. It is really important that you share your project with the rest of the class. It is both inspiring and helpful to other people to see your code and to see what you've been working on. One last thing, if you are like, well, what is math.ceil or math.random? These were covered in JavaScript 101 and JavaScript 201 as well, where we actually made a very, very similar project using just plain vanilla JavaScript. This way is just a little less code using just straight jQuery rather than just straight JavaScript.